The story of alcohol does not begin in factories or elegantly labeled wine bottles as we often think. It began long before that. Long before there were humans, before there was writing, and even before anyone thought about farming. About 10 million years ago in the forests of Africa, small primates picked up ripe fruits that had fallen to the ground and lain there too long. Inside those ripe fruits, natural sugars began to break down. Yeast from the air entered, and the fermentation process took place. Ethanol was produced. When the primates ate them, they felt a slight change, a light, pleasant feeling. They did not understand why, but they remembered that taste, and they continued to seek out such ripe fruits. Over millions of years of evolution, our ancestors did not only learn to tolerate alcohol, they developed a tendency to seek it out. Their sense of taste and nervous system gradually adapted to ethanol. By the time humans truly appeared, the preference for alcoholic beverages was already present in the genes. It was not something invented. It was something that had been programmed long before. So when did humans begin to actively produce beer and alcohol instead of relying only on naturally fermented fruits? When did we shift from accidentally getting drunk to intentionally making alcoholic beverages as we wished? The answer lies in caves and archaeological sites from tens of thousands of years ago. Places where our ancestors soaked grains, fermented, and created beer long before they knew how to farm. They made alcoholic beverages before agriculture, before writing. And perhaps the production of alcohol was one of the important reasons they decided to stop moving, build permanent settlements, and begin planting crops. Today we will travel back in time together to explore that entire journey. From ripe fruits fermenting on the forest floor in Africa 10 million years ago, to the stone mortars in Natufian caves 13,000 years ago, the giant stone vessels at Göbekli Tepe, and even the oldest beer/wine recipe in the world found in China. This is not just a story about alcohol, this is a story about one of the oldest relationships between humans and a chemical substance. A relationship that began before we were humans, and continues to this day. In 2014, a biologist at the University of California, Berkeley named Robert Dudley published a notable book called The Drunken Monkey. The central idea of the book is quite simple, but carries weight. Humanity's relationship with alcohol did not begin with ancient civilizations, but long before that, from the time when our ancestors were still primates living in trees. When a ripe fruit falls to the ground and lies there for a long enough time, the natural sugars inside the fruit begin to break down. Yeast from the air invades, the fermentation process occurs, and the ripe fruit gradually produces a small amount of ethanol. This is a completely natural process that happens every day in tropical forests. When primates eat this type of fruit, the ethanol inside makes them feel a slight change in their body, a light, pleasant feeling. They do not understand why, but that feeling makes them want to seek more. Over millions of years, primates did not only learn to tolerate alcohol, they evolved in the direction of seeking it out. Fermented ripe fruits provided a source of easily absorbed calories, and ethanol seemed to offer a small advantage in finding food or reducing stress. Gradually, the nervous system and sense of taste of our ancestors adapted to recognize and enjoy ethanol. By the time modern humans appeared, the preference for alcoholic beverages had been pre-programmed in the genes. Evidence for this hypothesis lies right in our bodies. The enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase, ADH, the enzyme responsible for breaking down ethanol in the body, in humans and some closely related primate species, has very high efficiency compared to many other animal species. This shows that our ancestors were exposed to ethanol frequently enough and long enough for the body to develop the ability to process it effectively. In other words, when humans began actively producing beer and alcohol tens of thousands of years ago, they were not doing something entirely new. They were simply continuing a relationship that had existed long before, a relationship that began with ripe fruits fermenting on the forest floor in Africa. But one important question remains. If our ancestors already had a tendency to seek out alcohol very early, then when did they begin actively producing alcoholic beverages as they wished instead of relying only on naturally fermented fruits? The answer lies in the caves of the Near East, where archaeologists have found clear evidence of beer production from 13,000 years ago, at a time when humans still did not know how to farm. In 2018, archaeologists excavating a cave near Haifa, Israel, called Raqefet. This cave was once used by a group of people called the Natufian, about 13,000 years ago. The Natufian people at that time still did not know how to farm. They still lived by gathering wild grains and hunting wild animals. Yet, when archaeologists analyzed the stone mortars carved directly into the cave floor, they found traces of wheat and barley that had been soaked in water, allowed to sprout, and then fermented. That was beer, brewed in the cave 13,000 years ago. This discovery is very significant. The Natufian people did not grow barley. They gathered wild barley, but they already knew how to soak, sprout, and ferment it to create alcoholic beverages. Beer production was clearly important enough to them that they spent the effort carving permanent stone mortars in the cave to do this. They actively produced alcoholic beverages before agriculture. Not far from Raqefet Cave at the Göbekli Tepe site in Turkey, famous for its giant T-shaped stone pillars erected about 11,000 years ago, archaeologists also found evidence of grain fermentation in large stone vessels. Göbekli Tepe is considered one of the earliest complex architectural works of humankind, built by hunter-gatherer groups. Finding traces of grain fermentation there further supports the idea that alcoholic beverage production played an important role in their society from very early on. But the earliest clear recorded evidence of a beer/wine recipe comes from elsewhere, the village of Jiahu in China. Around 7000 BC, residents there produced a type of fermented beverage from rice, honey, and fruit. Archaeochemist Patrick McGovern from the University of Pennsylvania analyzed residues in ancient pottery vessels and identified this as the oldest beer/wine recipe in the world ever known. What is noteworthy is that at all three sites, Raqefet Cave, Göbekli Tepe, and Jiahu, humans were actively producing alcoholic beverages before they invented agriculture as we usually understand it. They did not need to grow grains on a large scale to make beer. They gathered wild grains, fermented them, and created drinks. Beer and alcohol production seemed important enough to them that they were willing to spend time and effort on it, even when life was still based on hunting and gathering. Perhaps the need to produce alcoholic beverages was one of the factors that pushed humans to gradually shift toward settled life and farming. Beer and wine were not just something to drink for fun. They may have served as social lubricants, tools in ritual, and even economic drivers from very early on. But to better understand the role of alcohol in ancient societies, we need to look at a civilization where alcoholic beverages became an indispensable part of daily life and even the power of an entire empire, ancient Egypt. While the Natufian people and residents at Göbekli Tepe had already begun producing alcoholic beverages very early, by the time of ancient Egypt, beer and alcohol had become an indispensable part of the entire civilization. Beer in ancient Egypt was not a luxury reserved only for the upper class. It was the daily drink of nearly every social class. Workers building the pyramids at Giza received a daily ration of beer. Part of their compensation, beer provided calories, nutrients, and more importantly, it was much safer than Nile River water because the fermentation process killed bacteria. Drinking beer in Egypt at that time was almost a way to drink safe water. But beer did not stop at being just a beverage. It appeared in almost all religious rituals, in festivals, and even in political life. Egyptian gods such as Hathor and Osiris were all associated with beer and wine. In some ancient texts, beer was described as a gift from the gods to humans. The production and distribution of beer also became an important economic activity, with large-scale breweries built near temples and palaces. Interestingly, while many other civilizations considered wine a higher-class drink, in Egypt, beer was the more popular and preferred beverage. Wine was usually reserved for the upper class and special rituals. Beer belonged to everyone, from pharaohs to laborers. The fact that a civilization could build such giant structures as the pyramids partly thanks to a stable beer supply system for workers shows that alcoholic beverages were not just for entertainment. They had become a supporting factor for the development of organized society. Beer helped maintain the health and spirit of workers, while also creating an economic and social network around its production and distribution. Many researchers believe that the need to produce alcoholic beverages on a large scale may have been one of the driving forces pushing humans toward settled agriculture. When you need large amounts of grain to make beer, you tend to plant and manage that supply instead of just gathering wild. In this way, beer and alcohol were not only products of civilization, they may have contributed to creating civilization. But the relationship between humans and alcohol did not stop in Egypt. It continued to develop over thousands of years afterward, becoming part of almost every culture in the world. And to this day, we are still continuing a tradition that began with ripe fruits fermenting on the forest floor 10 million years ago. The relationship between humans and alcohol is one of the oldest relationships we have ever had. It did not begin in breweries or luxurious wine bottles. It began about 10 million years ago when our primate ancestors picked up ripe fruits that had fermented on the forest floor in Africa. Over millions of years of evolution, we did not only learn to tolerate ethanol, we developed a tendency to seek it out. About 13,000 years ago, the Natufian people in the Near East actively soaked wild barley and fermented it to create beer, before they knew how to farm. At Göbekli Tepe, traces of grain fermentation were also found in the large stone vessels of one of humankind's earliest complex architectural works. And in China, about 9,000 years ago, Jiahu residents had their own beer/wine recipe. Beer and alcohol appeared before agriculture, before writing, and even before many great civilizations. By the time of ancient Egypt, beer was not just a drink. It became part of the economic, social, and religious system. Pyramid construction workers received beer as rations. Religious rituals used beer as a gift from the gods. The production and distribution of beer helped maintain the health and spirit of an entire society building giant structures. Beer and alcohol were not only products of civilization. In many cases, they may have contributed to creating civilization by encouraging humans to settle, farm, and organize society on a larger scale. Today, when we raise a glass, we are participating in a tradition that has lasted millions of years. We no longer pick up fermented fruits on the forest floor. We no longer carve stone mortars in caves to brew beer. But the basic act, seeking out and consuming alcoholic beverages, is still part of us from long before there was a name called human. Perhaps the story of alcohol reminds us that many habits and preferences we think of as modern actually have deep roots in the evolutionary and cultural history of humankind. And understanding that origin can help us view our relationship with alcohol in a more sober and responsible way. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. If you find the content interesting, please like, share, and subscribe to explore more fascinating historical and scientific stories together. What do you think about the drunken monkey hypothesis? Did our ancestors really like alcohol from very early on, as scientists propose? Please leave your comments below. See you again in the next videos.